probably from other disciplines as well. Some of the things that I discuss. Am I audible? Am I clear? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Oh, okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So some of the things, or in fact, most of the things that I discuss here um, is tuned to the students and not so much to the teachers. So you might find certain things very basic, but I hope you would bear with me for going to the basics, because this particular talk is meant primarily for the students. So with this brief note, let's get into the business. Now, when we think of cultural studies, it's a term, or it's something that everybody keeps speaking about nowadays, particularly in humanities, not only in humanities, but social sciences as well. So, as the head of the department rightly pointed out, it has become a discipline with a transdisciplinary nature, and it's no longer pure literature that's being studied in our departments, in our language departments, and in many other disciplines. So we can say that it's one of the key things in contemporary academia. And it's, of course, an interdisciplinary field. Now, when we say it's an interdisciplinary field, we need to understand what is interdisciplinarity, or what do we mean by interdisciplinarity. Unless we understand what is interdisciplinarity, it becomes very difficult for us to conceptualize a discipline called cultural studies, which is a method of approach used by various disciplines. So what makes it interdisciplinary is a significant question. Now, traditionally speaking, or conventionally speaking, our universities and colleges generally or they teach us that knowledge is divided into academic disciplines. So you have a department of English, you could have a department of Hindi, you have department of history, you have department of political science, you have department of sociology. So these are all academic disciplines. So the very fact that we are trained, or we are tuned to look at knowledge as divided into academic disciplines tells us that knowledge production can happen. So there are, which means it tells us that knowledge is very much confined, very particular to disciplines. Or in other words, political science department would produce a certain kind of knowledge which has nothing to do with an English department, or which has nothing to do with literature, or which has nothing to do with sociology, or which has nothing to do with history, and so on. And when we try to understand knowledge like that, or when we begin to think about knowledge along those lines, you immediately understand the absurdity of it, right? That you can't really talk about any kind of knowledge that's produced purely within the confinements of certain disciplines. But this is the way traditionally and conventionally we have been made to believe, or knowledge has been arranged like that. So disciplines, in other words, provide the rationale for the departmental structure of colleges and universities. But of late, quite recently, there is a clear awareness that departments and disciplines do have some drawbacks. They do have some problems. If we begin to understand knowledge only along the lines of departments and disciplines, then there is a problem that doesn't really become proper knowledge. That kind of an awareness. So it's no longer safe to assume that people in particular disciplines, for example, teachers themselves, people in particular disciplines, share a lot of teachers, a lot of researchers in various disciplines. They share ideas of interest, methods, or even epistemological perspectives, even perspectives. There could be a lot of things that you can find as a common ground among these disciplines, among teachers, among researchers. They find knowledge as going beyond the boundary of, or they find interest in other disciplines as well, in other words. So we cannot understand interdisciplinarity without first examining the existing disciplines. Now, interdisciplinary approaches are an attempt to engage with various disciplines, first of all. When we say interdisciplinarity, or the moment we start speaking about interdisciplinary approaches, it's an attempt to engage with various disciplines and the modes of knowledge that they exclude by virtue of their separation from each other. So because political science department is not a literature department, a lot of things that would be excluded from their, from their area of interest. Because a literature department is not a department of political science, literature departments would, if you confine itself very specifically to a particular mode of cultural production called literature, then you would exclude probably a number of things that are happening in history, that are happening in sociology, that are happening in philosophy, that are happening in anthropology, and so on and so forth. So this raises a serious issue. Is it how knowledge is to be produced? So the term discipline has two significant usages in contemporary times. When we use the word discipline, one is it refers to a particular branch of learning or body of knowledge. That is one meaning of discipline. The other is it refers to the maintenance of order and control among subordinated groups. So you say disciplined, right? You discipline someone. In a college, you are expected to follow certain disciplines. So you maintain a certain order and control among subordinated groups. So for that, you use the idea of discipline. So the word discipline has these two meanings. Now, these two usages converged in some of the earlier uses of the term. For example, when I say they got converged, one is disciplining people, and then learning or body of knowledge, a branch of learning or body of knowledge. These two things. So you have to be very specific. So you have to discipline yourself, your knowledge. You have to discipline your knowledge to suit the kind of department that you belong to. That idea. So somewhere both these ideas got converged, and that's how disciplines slowly evolved. So the word discipline actually derives from the Latin word disciplina. That's the original Latin word, disciplina, which refers to the instruction of disciples by their elders, and it very clearly alludes to a specialized, valued knowledge which some people possess and others do not. So this is the original meaning of the word disciplina, Latin word. One is it means instruction of disciples by their elders. So elders, or we can say in our tradition maybe Gurukula system, where the guru gives instructions to disciples. Okay. So and then it also means a specialized valued knowledge which some people possess and not others. Only some people have access to that knowledge. So in a system of Gurukula, or in a system of ancient Greek and Roman academic system, you have the all-knowing guru, you have the all-knowing teacher. So not everybody possesses that knowledge. And this whole thing is generally known as disciplina, or the word referred to this idea of knowing and also giving instructions to people. So from the beginning itself, you understand that the term discipline was caught up with questions about the relationship between knowledge and power. So from the very beginning itself, from the very beginning itself means when you think about a word like discipline itself, you understand that the term had serious connotations with or serious links with the relationship between knowledge and power. Now, what is that relationship between knowledge and power? Here, I'm not going into the details of that relationship between knowledge and power right now, because that's a very vast area, and Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, has extensively discussed it. So I'm not going into the details of all that right now. But this very basic idea of the relationship between knowledge and power is something that we need to understand. That is, knowledge as produced and possessed by only some people. So you go to that person in order to acquire that knowledge. Now, if you want to go to that person in order to acquire that knowledge, you need to have the capital. Capital in the sense you need to have probably the social capital, the economic capital, the cultural capital, or whatever kind of capital. Anything that the capacity that you have to acquire that knowledge. So not everybody may have access to this person who possesses knowledge. Not everybody may have access to, an extended form of it is what you find even today when you have large scale privatization of institutions and all that. You understand that not everybody can have an access to these institutions of knowledge or institutions that provide you knowledge. So the whole relationship between knowledge and power, in a very simplistic sense, I'm talking about. I'm not going into the theoretical conceptualization of the relationship between knowledge and power right now. So what I want you to understand is the term discipline, right from its beginning, had this link with knowledge and power, or issues of knowledge and power, sites of production of knowledge, where knowledge is produced, whose knowledge. Somebody like you are immediately reminded of someone like Shambhuga, for example. I hope the students listening to me are aware of the figure of Shambhuga in Ramayana, for example. Shambhuga was killed by Rama during his Vanvas. Why? Because he acquired the Vedic knowledge. He read the Vedas, which was forbidden for the forest dwellers. So, or the you can, in different terms, you can use different terms. So, the Nishada, for example. So, Shambhuga was killed by Rama for that. So, knowledge, who has the power to acquire it? Who alone is entitled to acquire knowledge? And whose knowledge is it? Who is producing knowledge? These are all significant questions that need to be raised when you think about the relationship between knowledge and power. So my point is very simple, that right from the beginning itself, the idea of discipline was caught up with these questions of knowledge and power. So when we use a word like interdisciplinary, we are generally suggesting some kind of critical awareness of this relationship. So interdisciplinary, the moment you begin to talk about interdisciplinary, you are going to talk about the critical relationship. That is the critical relationship between knowledge and power. Actually, interdisciplinarity is not simply a method of studying too many things from different disciplines. It's not so simple. It is the very word itself then begins to question the relationship between knowledge and power. Who has access to knowledge? Who is producing knowledge? And what kind of knowledge it is, etc. So that's why, for example, I don't know if you have listened to me earlier anywhere. Maybe you may have. I would say, a biblical story like the story of Adam and Eve, for example. I'm sure most of you are familiar with that, the story of Adam and Eve. And there again, you find this issue very clearly articulated. That is, what happens in the story of Adam and Eve? God commands Adam and Eve not to pluck the fruit of the tree of knowledge. The tree in the Bible is known as the tree of knowledge and not anything else. So he asks the all-knowing, all-powerful, supposedly all-powerful, all-knowing God asks human being not to acquire knowledge. That's what's happening. Not to acquire knowledge. So that's why I would see that the supposed sin of Adam and Eve is a rebellious act of acquiring knowledge forcefully by human being. So there again, it's a question of discipline. Then God was trying to discipline them. Not so the whole problem of knowledge production, and knowledge acquisition becomes a significant issue for disciplines and interdisciplinary. So the moment you say interdisciplinary, it means we are not simply confining knowledge to certain areas alone. Instead, you're crossing the borders of that knowledge and trying to acquire knowledge from various sources. So the idea of shaping knowledge into disciplines can be traced as far back as the Greek philosophy itself, arranging knowledge into disciplines. And Aristotle, for example, organized different subjects in a hierarchy according to the significance of each discipline or each knowledge. Now, I'm not going into those details because we may not get enough time for that. And so the classical divisions of knowledge, the classical ways in which knowledge was divided into disciplines, that was eventually transformed by market forces and institutional changes. Market forces also, or historical forces also, change disciplines or generate new knowledge. We study literature today. We study history. We study political science. We study economics. All these disciplines were products of colonialism, primarily. They were all produced by colonial history, in fact. And neocolonialism, globalization, contemporary changes would produce new disciplines, management studies or computer science, the necessity of studying all this. So new changes in the society, new changes in economy, new changes in market forces, all these produce new knowledge, new disciplines, and new engagements, in fact. So one of the very significant factor in the formation of disciplines was the values of the Enlightenment in the late 17th and 18th centuries. Okay, so 17th and 18th centuries in Europe marked the evolution of what we understand as the Enlightenment. So it was a revolutionary change that Enlightenment brought about. It was a philosophical movement, and it made revolutionary changes in art, science, politics, and philosophy. So philosophers at this time were more interested in the progress of human knowledge through the powers of reason and rationality. They prioritized reason and rationality. So you understand everything. You understand everything in the universe with the help of your reason and rationality itself. Now, this pursuit of reason, this search for reason and rationality was upheld by the clear procedures and methodologies within disciplines. So disciplines began to change accordingly. They began to take up studies with inputs from the Enlightenment principles of rationality or reason. So you begin to understand things objectively. You feel that you can objectively understand something. You feel that social sciences, for example, many started believing that you can really study society objectively. This idea, all that comes from basically the scientific way of inquiring into things, which was propounded by Enlightenment. So science, this was a method of modern science, and which was adopted by social sciences as well as humanities. So the scientific revolution was based on two significant new notions in the 18th century. That is the view of nature as a well-ordered machine. Nature as a well-ordered, structured machine. The Newtonian conceptualization of the universe, for example. everything functioning in its orbit, everything functioning with a law, a principle behind it. So a well-ordered, structured universe. That was an idea that evolved in the Enlightenment period. So they also believed, the scientific revolution also believed that this was reducible to a relatively small number of universal rules established by humans. So human beings establish certain rules and principles that govern the working of the universe. So you can reduce what happens in the universe. Why you feel sun rises in the east and sun sets in the west, for example. You feel it because of such and such reasons. And you really formulate it in the form of certain universal rules. Now, this idea or these perspectives that new sciences achieved was actually a result of the origin of disciplines or disciplinarity, in other words. Knowledge being assigned or represented or confined to specific areas of knowledge. You need to have certain very specific formula, certain very specific rule according to which each discipline would explain the reality, that kind of an idea. So the reconfiguration of the disciplines that happened in the 18th century was not unchallenged, which means it was challenged quite early itself. It was challenged. For example, an Italian thinker, Giambattista Vico, I hope that's how we pronounce his name. I don't know Italian, so I just pronounced it the way I felt like. Okay, Giambattista Vico. Anyway, let's call him Vico for convenience. So the Italian thinker Vico claimed that the ascendancy of science and mathematics had led to the neglect of broad education in favor of specialist knowledge. So he opined that, or he observed that the growth, the emergence of science and mathematics actually resulted in a neglect of broad education, a general education, and this neglect was in favor of specialist knowledge. So discipline-wise knowledge. In a book, in a book which can be translated as The New Science, that's the title of the book that he wrote, The New Science, published in 1725. He claimed that knowledge is always constructed by humans rather than simply discovered in nature. This was a difference that he was trying to establish between other disciplines and the sciences. Sciences believed that knowledge is there in nature. You need to discover it. You need to understand it. But the human sciences, like history, philosophy, and law, and all these are concerned with humans and society and can achieve knowledge and understanding from within. You can understand from the society itself. You can understand from the from human beings themselves. You can understand the behavior of human beings, why a social issue happens, etc. So they believed that. So he was trying to say that there is a difference between the sciences and the human sciences, because the sciences believe that knowledge or secrets of the universe are there in the universe. You just need to discover it. But here you actively construct it. You actively find it out. I mean, not just discover it. You actively find, construct ways of looking at society. You actively construct perspectives to approach, social issues, etc. So the critique of the academic disciplines that happened in the 18th century itself, that critique. Okay, sorry. The critique to dividing knowledge into disciplines was something that happened along with the emergence of disciplines themselves. So the term interdisciplinary emerged within the context of these anxieties, but that became very significantly that came to be significantly articulated only after the Second World War. In a very significant manner. The term interdisciplinarity as a significant method of approach. which means moving away from disciplinary knowledge and going into other disciplines as well, or taking cues from other disciplines and formulating new methods of inquiry. So interdisciplinarity means any form of dialogue or interaction between two or more disciplines. So a dialogue or interaction between disciplines. Now we must also differentiate interdisciplinary from the term multidisciplinary. Sometimes we use them as synonymous. We use them synonymously sometimes, right? Multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary. In fact, multidisciplinary is a term which refers to the simple fact of two or more disciplines. Here, the relationship between the disciplines is merely one of proximity. There is no real integration between them. In a term like multidisciplinary, there is no integration between disciplines, but you just have many disciplines, all disciplines. So you can have a college, a multidisciplinary, the college is multidisciplinary, of course. A university is multidisciplinary, of course. But you cannot have, you can also have a multidisciplinary approach. A single person can have a multidisciplinary approach as well. But then what happens? He or she would be taking a stand taking stands in different ways. That is, he would speak. He would look at a particular issue. For example, if you have to address an issue like poverty, poverty is there all around us. There are poor people. So poverty is approached. How a person from economics would approach poverty. You adopt that method and approach. And the next day or the next moment, you can approach poverty, the issue of poverty, from a philosophical standpoint, or the issue of poverty from the standpoint of a sociologist, for example. Now, then you are being multidisciplinary, but you are not integrating disciplines. Whereas interdisciplinarity is different from multidisciplinarity, because interdisciplinarity integrates disciplines together. You cannot have a pure sociological perspective and then next moment or next day a pure economic perspective. Instead, you bring together economic perspectives, sociological perspectives, historical perspectives of poverty on the same platform and approach the issue in a more comprehensive manner. That is what we do in interdisciplinary approach. So interdisciplinarity is always transformative in some way, producing new forms of knowledge in its engagement with different disciplines. So an interdisciplinary approach, when you use sociological theories, when you use historical perspectives, when you use economic perspectives to understand a social issue, what you do is you are engaging with different disciplines, but then you produce new kind of knowledge, which cannot be confined simply to sociology, economics, or political science, or history, or literature. Instead, it's a new knowledge that transcends disciplines, in other words. So now let's examine literature as a discipline. Literature as a discipline, let's examine literature as a discipline in order to show that it has always been driven by competing impulses, very competing, interests, which means it's always sought to make it more of a hard science by limiting its area of concern to a recognized phenomenon called literature. So almost like the sciences, literature as a discipline also concentrated on one tangible, recognizable phenomenon called the literary text. You are limiting your entire focus to the literary text alone, the literary text that is written by some individual. So you are limiting it. You have a tangible, recognizable object in hand in order to study. And then at the same time, it aimed to establish itself as the interdisciplinary center of the humanities. At the same time, so this is a kind of paradoxical situation that literature had right from its beginning. That is, on the one hand, it limited its study to pure literary text, an object. And then at the same time, it wanted to be at the center of humanities study, literature as something that is required for everybody, something that is required for every discipline. So it wanted to be in that position as well. Almost like, in the place of classics and philosophy. That was the case in the past, in ancient period. But in the place of classics and philosophy, literature, in fact, literature replaced classics and philosophy and wanted to be at the center of all humanistic studies. Now, another thing is, when you come to something like cultural studies, it is redefining and expanding the notion of culture as an object of academic study. Cultural studies is redefining and expanding the notion of culture, the way culture was generally understood. I'll come to that point a little later, because before that we need to also see interdisciplinarity and the link between interdisciplinarity and literature. After that, we'll go into that particular point. Now, literature has often been torn between two things. It was pulled by two things from two sides. One is the institutional necessity to mark its territory or define its activities and justify its autonomy from other areas of study. Literature had to establish its territory. That's an institutional necessity. Once you have disciplines, once you have institutionally arranged method of imparting knowledge, like college, university, etc. Once you impart knowledge through institutions, so literature had to really mark its territory. What do we do? What do we do differently from others? We in English departments, or we in literature departments function, our object of study is something. It is such and such thing. It is the literary text. And that is our business. And this is not, that is not the business of someone in history. That is not the business of someone in sociology, for example. So institutional necessity to mark its territory and then define its, define its activities. That is one pull from one side. Then another pull from the other side is that its reliance on the approaches and subject matter of other disciplines. That is the problem. That is a problem. That was a problem. In the sense, on the one hand, because of the necessity of the institution, you establish literature as a discipline and literary text as an object of study. At the same time, in order to study these literary texts, what did people do? They approached other disciplines. In the sense, sociology, history, political science, etc. Because right from the time you were talking about historical background of literature, the very moment literature as a discipline was established in the late 18th century and 19th century and all that, once it was evolving, people were talking about the historical background, the author's background, or the Elizabethan spirit, for example, right? When you study something like Shakespearean texts, the Elizabethan spirit, you speak about the Elizabethan spirit, as though there is one single Elizabethan spirit there throughout the 16th century, right? One spirit. And so every text in the Elizabethan period is a reflection of that supposedly, overarching, all-encompassing, Elizabethan spirit. You believe so. So people thought about a background. People thought about a historical background, the author's background. So author's biography was therefore very important for understanding literary texts. You find one-to-one connections, right, between events discussed in the text and the author's life, etc. So, you are going out of the text. In a way, you are going out of the text in order to understand the text. So you are crossing disciplines. You are going into other disciplines as well when you do that. So this was a tension that literary studies always experienced right from the beginning. Now, unlike many other disciplines, literature does not make a strong connection between education and training for future careers. Perhaps in many other disciplines, what happens is there is a training for future careers. a particular kind of career that you want to follow. Economics, okay, you study this, and then you have, or commerce, you study that, and then what happens? You have a career in that particular kind of discipline. You become an accountant or whatever, certain ways of establishing career for people. But literary studies do not do that. It doesn't make such a direct link between a particular training and what you study. So literature is generally accessible to people working outside the discipline as well, right? Literature is available to everybody. For example, a novel, a poem, a drama, all that is available in bookshops and libraries. And everybody, irrespective of your discipline, whether you belong to literature, whether you belong to biosciences, whether you belong to physics or political science or sociology or history, you read them. So literature is accessible to everybody. It is appealing to everybody in that sense. So one of the reasons for this is that literature is about everything in human life: love, sex, friendship, family relationships, aging, death, social and historical changes, religious faith, intellectual ideas. All these things are there in literary texts in different ways. So that's one of the reasons why everybody gains access to literature, and literature has an access to everybody. So in short, literature is about life in all its diversity. I'm not saying it reflects life or anything like that. No, it is about life in all its diversity, and therefore it was always becoming something else. Literary studies was always undergoing changes from the very beginning itself, because it is about life in its diversity itself. So that is where we need to think about the shift from literature to culture. There is a sense, there is a way in which contemporary field of cultural studies can be seen as synonymous with interdisciplinarity itself. So when you talk about something like cultural studies, it is almost synonymous with interdisciplinarity, because it draws upon almost all disciplines that we have today: sociology, anthropology, history, linguistics, philosophy, textual criticism, visual culture, the philosophy of science, geography, politics, economics, psychology, and so on and so forth. It draws upon all these disciplines, literary studies, or sorry, cultural studies. It takes cue, not just taking cues, but it has to address all these disciplines. Only then it can conceptualize human life and culture. So one of its effects, one of the effects of cultural studies has been to challenge the disciplinary identity of literary studies, the disciplinary confinement of literary studies. It challenged, cultural studies challenged that confinement or confined position of literary studies. By how did it do that? How did cultural studies do that? Cultural studies questioned or challenged the disciplinary compartmentalization of literature by dissolving the category of literature into the more inclusive notion of culture. So literature no longer becomes the central question in cultural studies. Literature is not the central question, but literature was dissolved into a notion called culture, which means literature is just one of the cultural productions. Just one of the cultural productions. You can have a film, you can have a play, you can have a literary text, you can have a ritual, you can have a folk art form, you can have a classical art form, you can have your food habits, you can have your dressing style. You can talk about all this in cultural studies, and literary text is just one such cultural production or one such cultural product. So the idea of, so the disciplined literary text was dissolved into a more inclusive and encompassing term or notion called culture. And this is a term, this was I mean, this is what we understand as the cultural term in literary studies. So cultural studies is rooted in socialist politics and new social movements such as feminism, anti-racism, gay activism, lesbian activism, etc. It is rooted in socialist politics. You cannot talk about simply a literary text the moment you begin to think of feminism or anti-racism or whatever you're talking about. So how cultures construct identities, how cultures construct or how representations construct identities and subjectivities. All these become very important. I'll explain those things a little further. So, what cultural studies does is it is committed to integrative studies, integrating various methodologies, integrative studies, and also expands the definition of culture. It expands the definition of culture from a very limited sense, and raises questions about cultural construction of identity. That is a significant point in cultural studies. How cultures construct identities, how identities are constructed by cultures. For example, female identity, how a female identity is constructed in society, how a male identity is constructed in society. Right from the time, so you cannot think of only literary texts. I'm sorry, I may not be so visible to you. It's okay because there is no power now. There was a power failure. Okay, so but I hope I'm audible still. So when you think about something like female identity, what happens there? How female identity gets constructed? In order to understand that, you are in cultural studies, you are not only approaching the canonical texts, the canonical literature, conventionally accepted as great literature, great work of art. No, that idea of great work of art, that idea of great literature is something that cultural studies would seriously question. There is nothing like that. I'll come to that point also later. Anyway, so female identity, if you want to look at how a female identity gets constructed, you cannot simply go into those literary texts alone. But how, for example, our serials, TV serials, how those TV serials can construct the idea of good woman and bad woman. In most of the TV serials, one of them would be, or there would be a woman who is out and out good, with all virtues, all enduring, all sacrificing woman. And she is pitted against a villainous kind of woman. So, how a woman should be and how a woman should not be is something that TV serials would continuously tell you. And this is what mythologies have told us also. This is what literature has often discussed also. So in order to understand the evolution of female identity, our notions of femininity, in other words, what a woman should be, how a woman should be, in order to understand how it got evolved, how it got entrenched in our social thinking, you cannot simply go into only one text or a few literary texts alone. You may have to go to mythologies and see how mythologies have spoken, how even religious texts have spoken about women. So how over a long period of time, feminine identity gets entrenched in our consciousness. That is, what is an ideal woman or who is an ideal woman. Similarly, how a man has evolved. So how the idea of man has evolved over a period of time. If somebody passes away at home, in our families, or among our relations, what happens? If something like that happens to my relatives and so on, then if I go there and cry, people would say, why are you crying like a woman? Don't cry, you should give courage to everybody, right? And if a woman in the family doesn't cry, oh, look at that woman, not even a single tear from her eyes, people would say, right? So women are expected to be emotional beings. And this is not because somebody told us. This is because mythologies, religious texts, cultural productions, all kinds of cultural productions, literally, including literary texts, they have consistently and historically constructed female identity and also male identity. So when a child is born into a family, what happens if the child is a girl? What happens? Maybe after some time you buy her dolls. And if it's a boy, you buy him pattern tanks, JCB, then what? Guns, right? So what happens? Right from infancy, right from childhood, we are constructing male and female identities very clearly, consciously telling individuals that you are a man and you are a woman, you are a girl, you are a boy, that kind of thing. There is a difference. So certain roles have been assigned to women, certain roles have been therefore assigned to men. So this, all this happens, all this identity construction happens through cultural productions. That's the point I was trying to tell you. And literature is only one such cultural production for cultural studies. So studying literature is not, or in order to study literature, you cannot simply look into the text alone. If you want to study a novel, which is which speaks about all kinds of things in human life, then you cannot study the text in a pure linguistic manner. You have to talk about sociological evolution of maybe femininity or masculinity, or how our films project certain notions of feminine and male identities, or Dalit Adivasi identities, or minorities, how our films constantly have villains with Islamic names or a Goan Christian name, etc. What impact it has got on the popular imagination of these identities. Or why, I'm sure most of you have seen movies, films with two heroines, for example, right? Two heroines and one hero. Then what happens? One of the women, one of the heroines would be out and out modern, right? Modern in quotes, very out and out modern with jeans and t-shirt. And the other heroine would be very traditional with sari and things like that. And in the history of Indian films, this is about, my knowledge may be very limited, but I must tell you, in the history of Indian films, I have never seen a hero ultimately marrying a modern woman. I've seen only the hero marrying the traditional woman, the traditional sari clad, all sacrifice, all enduring, sacrificing heroine. The modern woman, what happens? The modern figure who is competing with the other woman either withdraws at the end from the competition, or she gets killed, or something of that sort happens. So the ideal femininity. So films construct ideal femininity or identity of the female in that way. So you have to understand all these in order to understand the construction of femininity in a literary text as well. So you cannot simply study literary text purely with the help of linguistic theories. Now, so cultural studies, therefore, very systematically and very consistently talks about the broader operations of power in society, how power operates in society. That power could be various kinds of power structures. Now, cultural studies, in short, cultural studies engages with the concerns about the politics of knowledge, and this is what I've been telling you all this while, politics of knowledge and representation. One thing that it seriously addresses, politics of knowledge. who produces what kind of knowledge. So when you have such representations in films, in TV serials, in literary texts, etc., how Dalits and Adivasis are represented, for example, how minorities are represented, for example. So how blacks are represented in Hollywood films, for example. Now all these, when you consider all these questions, this is a knowledge, this is a process of production of knowledge. Production of what kind of knowledge? Knowledge about identity, knowledge about blacks, knowledge about minorities, knowledge about women, knowledge about men as well, of course. So nowadays you have masculinity studies in a very significant manner, how masculinity is getting produced, particularly in contemporary times, the macho figures and so on and so forth. So politics of knowledge. Is knowledge apolitical? Is knowledge innocent and neutral? It's not. Knowledge, what kind of knowledge is produced? What is the politics behind it? And what kind of representation takes place? Through that representation, how particular kind of knowledge about identities is produced? All these are questions that cultural studies would seriously engage with. So the site of production of knowledge, or whom does it privilege the knowledge? In order to understand this, you have to probably, I'll give you an example. Like in the colonial period, you have the discipline called anthropology emerging during that time. As I told you, most of the disciplines anyway emerged during the period of colonialism. So anthropology, the British anthropologists often travel to Africa, Asia, and such places to study human beings, as though there were no human beings in Britain. And they started comparing anthropological, and they're finding, for example, the pictures of skull, for example, skull of an African man or woman, and the skull of Asians, and the skull of Europeans. So there are obvious differences in the shape and in its structure. So they would say these Africans and Asians are all still in the process of evolution, Darwin's evolutionary theory, remember. Europeans are the completely evolved human beings. Now this is knowledge. A discipline produces this kind of a knowledge, remember. And this gets accepted by people who study it. So you begin to think that you are still in the process of evolution. Okay. And therefore, everything European is much better than ourselves. I'm not saying anthropology is solely responsible for that, but anthropological knowledge, which was actually sanctioned knowledge in institutions. And this is what, and for example, when you think about race theories, 19th century European race theories and even caste system in India, for example. In a book called Caste, Society and Politics in India, it's a book by Susan Bailey. Here, the author elaborately quotes a letter that was written to British Parliament by a student studying in Britain. The student is originally from India. And what he wrote was, and this letter is still available in the British Museum. Okay. So this letter that he wrote contained things like this, and I'll tell you. It's almost like this. While deciding on promotions in institutions, colonial institutions, etc., while deciding on promotions, you should first consider the Brahmins in India, because we Brahmins possess pure blood. This is an argument made by an Indian in the 19th century in a letter that he wrote to British Parliament. Okay. So how European race theories and Indian caste consciousness work together in that context. Now, so these are different ways. So knowledge production is not a neutral and innocent activity. Who produces the knowledge becomes very important. The sites of production of knowledge, SITE, site of production of knowledge. What or whom does the knowledge privilege, or for whom it is produced? who benefits, and so on. So who benefits? So when institutions and family tell you that you know you are a woman and therefore you have to forgive, it's a particular kind of knowledge produced about female identity. Now it is benefited by men in a way. So these are, a few stray examples that I'm trying to give you in order to explain what I was telling you. Now at this stage, we must also understand what culture is in cultural studies. Now dictionaries would tell you that it is collectively the customs, beliefs, art, way of life, social organization of a particular group, etc. So you have the idea of Kerala culture, as though we have a separate, very clear culture. We cannot talk about something like Kerala culture or even Indian culture. Everybody is talking about Indian culture. But the moment you start traveling from this down south Kerala to the length and breadth of the country, what do you find? People speaking different languages, people dressing differently, people having different food habits, people, even physical features very different. South Indians and North Indians, then Keralites and Tamilians and Kannadigas and all that, or everybody, or if you go to the Northeast, everybody. So different. And still, we somehow unconsciously believe that there is something called Indian culture. It's an absurd myth. It's the case not only with India, it's the case with all countries and the entire world, in fact. So you divide cultures into nations sometimes. Then you further divide cultures into states sometimes. So Kerala culture, Tamil culture, Kannada culture, etc. It's an absurd division because people are very different. So culture is actually a mixture, simply a mixture, and language is one integral part of it. It is not only an abstract entity, culture is also a material entity, because you cannot talk about culture only through, you cannot talk about culture as simply an abstract attribute, because everything that you include under the title culture, literature would be part of culture, a ritual may be part of culture, a festival may be part of culture, food habits may be part of culture, dressing pattern may be part of culture, all these. You cannot think about culture without materiality, without material things, even tangible things. So it's not simply an abstract attribute. That's what I'm trying to tell you. It is very much material. Even literature, its production, its author, the royalty that the author gains, the way he or she tries to market himself, so many things are there involved in literature. That's how literature comes into your hand. It's not an innocent kind of relationship that you have between you as a reader and author. So much market force works behind a literary text before it reaches you. So it's economic. It's very clearly economic. Every cultural production is also, that is implicated within probably a sociological, economic processes. You cannot think about culture as a separate entity. That is why, cultural studies would see culture as, an all-encompassing condition of society. Everything. That's why, Raymond Williams, a significant British cultural theorist, would say that culture is ordinary. Culture is not only that high class, high and low. Cultural studies would not approve of the division between high culture and low culture, or high class and low class. It doesn't distinguish. It says for example, there is no stability or timelessness about high and low cultures. For example, Shakespeare, we learn Shakespeare as part of British high culture. That's how we learn it. But Shakespeare wrote and staged plays for the masses in England, ordinary people in England. When he was doing it, he was not part of high culture at all. So there is no fixity about it. What is dominant today in society, what is subservient and very what is considered low in society, LOW in society today, may become high next day, some other day. And cultural studies doesn't distinguish between high culture and low culture. It just believes culture is, more importantly, it believes that culture is ordinary, very ordinary. The lived experiences of people, the everyday experiences of people. That is what culture is. And cultural studies also believes that culture is continuously being constructed. Culture is continuously getting constructed. It is not static. When we say Indian, this a particular thing, this is against Indian culture. If you say that, it means we have a wrong notion of Indian culture as a static thing, which originated sometime in the dim, distant past and continues to exist without any change. That is the idea we then have in our mind. But cultural studies would believe that there is nothing like a static, timeless culture. Culture is continuously changing. It's constantly evolving, and it's not sui generis. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. Suddenly, culture doesn't come to the forefront in that sense. So there are many cultural studies. More importantly, when it thinks about culture, it would also say that the changes in culture happen according to certain forces, and these forces are continuously operating within every culture. And so these forces could be termed as power, the operation of power. It could be class power, it could be caste power, it could be power in terms of gender, it could be power in terms of race, colonialism, globalization, political administrative power, and so on and so forth. All kinds of power structures work behind the evolution of culture. For example, in the period of globalization, we say our culture is changing. It's not that our culture is changing only during the period of globalization. Our culture has always changed. For example, it's a land that produced texts like Kama Sutra or the sculptures of Khajuraho temple. Can you think of an artist doing a similar kind of thing today? Would you treat it as part of Indian culture, or would you say that it's all pervert, kind of thing? Or you could even say that it's consciously maligning particular religion, and etc. So many things would come up. Or somebody writing a text like Kama Sutra today. Now, cultures have always changed. Our notion of Indian culture, in other words, they say, there are people who argue that it was an invention of the colonial period, our understanding of Indian culture today. And it's not only the case with Indian culture. All cultures are continuously, all over the world, cultures are constantly changing. They interact and collide with different cultures, and they evolve into something else. So when you look at cultural studies from, or when you look at a text from a cultural studies perspective, you look at the ideological forces operating within the text. The ideological forces, maybe patriarchal forces, maybe caste forces, or maybe race, colonial forces, the forces of globalization, everything around you. These ideological forces operating and determining an interpretation for you, or giving you an interpretation. So you can look at the text from different perspectives. It becomes possible under cultural studies. And you are no longer simply reading, you are no longer simply trying to find out a universal human nature in the text. when you do a cultural studies reading of the text. Universal human nature and things like that. Instead, you are looking at how representations happen, for example, how certain identities are represented in the text, how certain identities are represented in not only literary text. For cultural studies, text doesn't mean only literary text. Anything that is represented is a text for cultural studies. A mythical story is a text. An advertisement is a text for cultural studies. So in an advertisement, what happens? You have different kinds of advertisements. And what kind of an ideology? What caste ideology? What gender ideology operates behind advertisements? You can probably look at all that. It's possible. As I often say, for example, advertisements of washing machines and soap powders, washing powders, and so on. What happens? Why it is intended to appeal to women, thereby reinforcing the patriarchal ideology that washing is women's business. It is women's business, that is the idea. That's a patriarchal ideology. So how you can save your time is the question. Modernity, that is the curious mixture of modernity and tradition in our context. Modernity in our context, or modernity and technology, in other words, in our culture, in our context, is used very strategically by existing power structures. They wouldn't question, these power structures would not question, existing patriarchal ideologies or such, divisions in society. Instead, it would make you feel that you are being empowered. It would make women feel that you are getting empowered because you get more time and you can do some other things. Your work becomes easy if you use this particular technology, this particular pressure cooker, this particular washing machine. You get more time and you can do something. But still, it doesn't question, it would not raise a question like whether it is your business alone, that particular activity, cooking or washing or whatever. Is it only women's activity? It would not question that. It would not probably raise that question often. Instead, it would make you feel that you are being empowered. So these are the ways in which cultural studies would definitely look at. There are so many other things that actually we need to discuss when we talk about cultural studies. So anyway, let me try to wind up. I know it's taken an hour. So cultural studies, in short, argues that power acts upon our way of life. Our life is determined and controlled by power structures, various kinds of power structures operating in our society. There are many institutions of power, as Foucault would say. Michel Foucault uses this term, institutions of power. So different institutions of power, like family is an institution of power. Family would very clearly, family is the place where you first begin to imbibe, powerful ideologies, especially to live like a man and a woman, etc. Now, all this patriarchal ideology operates so powerfully within family. So, family, religion, educational institutions, law, etc. Law is also, such a category, which where power operates, and power has great impact on our way of life, on our routines and habits, even our habits, on our routines and habits in different ways. So these power structures can be categorized like gender, caste, race, class, colonialism, globalization, or whatever you want to add. Things that actually control production of knowledge, production of identity, everything. So what cultural studies therefore does is to constantly engage with this question of power, how power operates. What are the ways in which power operates in literary texts, in films, in advertisements, and so on and so forth. It is not, it is against essentialism. Cultural studies is against essentialism. It would not believe that there is something called an essence, essential culture. As I told you earlier, that is about Indian culture, Kerala culture, and so on and so forth. It would not believe that there is something fixed. Culture as a fixed entity. So, with these, then popular culture studies is an important subdivision of cultural studies, of course. Nowadays, we don't need to probably distinguish cultural studies and popular cultural studies, but popular culture studies is an important aspect of it because it conducts inquiries which deal with customs, artifacts, events, myths, language, etc. in any particular culture, and even and also mass media becomes a significant object of inquiry for popular culture studies. As I was telling you, advertisements, films, and so on, how they construct certain very specific notions about identities, subjectivities, then about people from particular regions, about people from particular religions, so on and so forth. So, and then about patriarchal notions, heterosexuality, so the normal sexuality and abnormal sexuality. So how transgenders have a problem with all our films, probably, because all our films would speak only about heterosexual relationship. As though that is the only normal, relationship. We have been made to believe that that is the normal relationship. So sexuality becomes a serious question for cultural studies. So there is nothing, in short, there is nothing that probably cultural studies doesn't address. Everything is addressed, and the literary text as a significant entity has lost its validity in cultural studies. It becomes just one of the objects of analysis. You can analyze anything, experiences of people, experiences of women, for example. There are people who most of you are students, I know. So I would say there are people who have worked here at MA. There are people who have done dissertations on the experience of menstruation, for example. That would not have been possible the way menstruation has been represented in media, how it has been represented in literary texts, how it has been represented in religious texts, how it has been represented in various other discourses in myths, mythologies, and how what people feel, what are the lived experiences of women. So these kinds of studies would not have been possible before the emergence of cultural studies. In a literature department. So cultural studies is thoroughly transforming our disciplines. It is thoroughly, destroying the boundaries of disciplines. It is also asking, that also means even when it destabilizes literature, that doesn't mean, you just ignore literature. There is no literature. That's not the point. It is only one of the cultural productions. So people in sociology, people in history would seriously study literary texts as well. Until then, their method of study was different. They would study certain sanctioned things alone, limited to their, limited to their disciplines. But people would look at, literary texts and see how culture is negotiated in literary texts from the point of view of ideologies, discourses, power, etc. So this becomes possible only after the advent of cultural studies. And therefore, that is a discipline which transcends all disciplines. And it's a method of approach, primarily. And thank you for listening to me all this while. I hope you could get some idea. I know I haven't exhausted, I haven't really discussed cultural studies and its theory, because I was told that most of you would be students, so I didn't want to really go into core theories of cultural studies. Instead, I wanted to just talk about the ways in which a discipline evolved and what are the things that it actually it does to our academy. Thank you very much for listening to me. Now you can, if you have any, if you need any clarifications, you can, or if you want to supplement with your own examples, you can do that.
Um, Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, not just for sparing your time, but also helping us to gain an insight into the what and why of culture studies. I extend my heartfelt gratitude on behalf of myself and the Department of English, MSM College, Kayangulam. I also want at this moment to thank our HOD, Dr. Rubina S, for encouraging this venture. And dear friends, I would love to share that we would be meeting soon with another series of lectures to get you introduced into other areas of literature and theory as well. Thank you. So we may wind up the session.
No questions or anything? Nobody wants to ask any question?
Sir, they were asked to send the questions if they had some doubts
Okay.
after the lecture. So
Okay.
we'll get back to you.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Okay. So I can leave now. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.